Thank you all for joining the launch of our training facilitation guide on heightened human rights due diligence. So, just quickly to kind of walk you through the next hour, what's going to happen. I'm going to give a brief introduction as to how this guide came to be, and then we're fortunate to have the three authors of the guide, Josie, Kate, Ben Miller, and Sarah Chvala. And I apologize, Sarah, if I butchered your surname. To give you the key kind of highlights of the guide, what kind of value it's going to add. And then we'll have a panel with our esteemed panelists I'll introduce later that will try to, break down how this guide can be used, how heightened human rights due diligence can be operationalized, and what's next, what's missing in the field before turning it over to you, the audience, for questions. And I think, and Amy will correct me if I'm wrong, my colleague Amy's here also from UNDP, that you can share questions in the chat. And I think that, once you share questions in the chat, we'll be able to get to them later on in the hour. So with that being said, without further ado, I just wanted to give you, as I said, a brief overview of how this guide came to be, this training facilitation guide. So in brief, in 2022, many of you might be familiar with the fact that we developed the guide on heightened human rights due diligence for businesses, published by UNDP and the Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And we saw immediately that the guide was filling a need because a lot of businesses, governments, and others reached out for training seminars, and we've seen it used in a variety of programming, laws, policies. So just to highlight a couple of mentions, one is that the guide has been integrated in the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Another one is that it's been mentioned in national action plans, and we've also seen it mentioned even as a condition for receiving assistance by governments in conflict-affected contexts. So clearly, the guide itself did a sort of valuable thing in terms of defining what heightened human rights due diligence is, what are the responsibilities of businesses in conflict-affected contexts, and so on. And in our programming, we've used it and are using it in contexts such as Libya, where we have in the past year done capacity building and trainings for nearly 200 businesses, oil and gas companies and others. In Ukraine, where we've trained over 900 companies on heightened human rights due diligence and help provide training and so on. And in Palestine, where one of our panelists is coming from, our colleague Omar, where we have launched our business human rights programming over the past year. In addition to that, there's just a sort of never-ending stream of requests for advice and seminars and guidance and so on, reflecting the fact that the number of conflicts is on continuous rise and has been and continues to be over the past 10 years. So with that being said, although the guide itself is valuable, we recognized a couple of areas of need as well and a couple of gaps that the guide itself left. One is that we've heard from investors that there's a need for guidance that's specific to them. And that's something we'd like to rectify this year. So we're working on guidance for investors on heightened human rights due diligence, because investors obviously have quite different needs from, from businesses operating in conflict-affected contexts. And the other one is what this publication is supposed to address, which is that although companies and others came back to us and said the guide is very useful in defining concepts and providing a way forward and a way to think about the responsibilities of businesses in conflict-affected contexts, at the same time, there's a need for concrete examples, training materials, and so on. So we set out to develop that in partnership with our authors who are here and who will come next. Just to give you a quick overview, obviously the guide itself is available online, and I think Amy can share a link to the guide, but the training facilitation guide contains 8 modules. One is a sort of refresher on business human rights and what is the background, and the second one is what is heightened human rights due diligence. And then we get into the actual business case for heightened human rights due diligence and when companies should perform heightened human rights due diligence. So again, talking about red flags, triggers, and so on, before we get into the nitty-gritty in part 3 of the training facilitation guide of how to carry it out, what are the actual steps from understanding the conflict to identifying potential actual impacts of the business on conflict and human rights, and all the way to eventually communicating and disclosing steps on heightened human rights due diligence. The training facilitation guide comes with a resource pack. So you have resources that you can consult, key information, important tips, and so on. And it comes possibly most valuably with a case study pack of 5 case studies that you'll be able to consult and see what either was done or what should have been done by companies in conflict affected contexts. And we hope this can help those present here conceptualize how either their companies or companies that they're dealing with should be acting in conflict affected areas by providing real life examples drawn from experience. So without further ado, that was our introduction. I'll hand it over to Josie, Ben, and Sarah, who will discuss, who will delve a bit deeper into the training facilitation guide itself. Josie, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sanisha, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Josie Diana Kay. I'm the CEO and founder of TrustWorks. We focus on responsible business in conflict-affected and high-risk areas and have been working with multinationals, investors, and governments on this topic for over 12 years. And I'm joined by senior advisors Ben Miller and Sarah Chavala. So it's really such a pleasure to be here, and I would really like to sincerely thank UNDP for this opportunity to present today and also for the opportunity to lead on the authorship of the guide. So we decided to really focus on 3 questions today that we think are really central to the guide. So the first is obviously, what is heightened human rights due diligence? I'll then hand over to Ben to cover what are the key differences between human rights due diligence and heightened human rights due diligence, and then what are the key steps of the hHRDD process, which Sarah will be covering. So we know, first of all, as Sanisha just underscored, that conflict is increasingly reflected in a very complex policy landscape. So it originally started with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, building on the very extensive work already conducted on conflict sensitivity, that really talks about this concept of proportionality. So the idea that a company's risk mitigation measures must be proportional to the risks that they face. In conflict-affected areas, these risks are higher, and therefore the mitigation measures that companies put in place should also be in some shape or form higher. Then in 2020, there was the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, which set out to then elaborate further on what was meant by this concept of proportionality and really drawing upon this concept of heightened human rights due diligence. UNDP then developed their guide, which Sanisha has just mentioned. And then over the years, we've really seen the evolution of this field further and further with the development of the OECD guidelines, which built on the previous version and really also elaborated on this concept of what they call enhanced due diligence. And then the UNDP training facilitation guide, which came out, or which was finalized last year, but which is being launched here today, and also reflected in the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. What I think is important to recognize is that conflict is made explicit in everything above the line here on this diagram and on the last slide. But in our opinion, conflict is also implicit in everything that is underneath the line. And that is because we know that companies' most salient risks across the board, whether it's related to forced labor, child labor, deforestation, etc., are found in conflict-affected and high-risk areas. So what is it that we're seeking to address here? So we're trying to address this concept of conflict risk. So conflict risk has 3 key components, 2 of which are really addressed here in the guide. The first is enhanced or the heightened risk of human rights abuses. The second is violations of international humanitarian law. And the third is then the risk of causing, exacerbating, or sustaining conflict. Each of these requires different analytical processes. So the first, of course, human rights due diligence. Most companies are already very familiar with the human rights due diligence framework. The second is an IHL legal analysis. And then the third is conflict analysis. These analytical tools, then come together to form what is known as heightened human rights due diligence. So heightened human rights due diligence involves combining human rights due diligence with a conflict analysis. And this is because human rights are known in advance. Most companies can tell you what their most salient human rights risks are. However, when it comes specifically to what is driving conflict, that's extremely contextual. So it's not even at the national level or even at the subnational level. It's really at the local level that we need to do this conflict analysis in the area where companies have actual business operations to understand how a company's business activities might be connected to the actors and the factors that are driving the conflict. And this is what constitutes heightened human rights due diligence. So a company that is only conducting a human rights due diligence in a conflict-affected or high-risk area is going to be capturing what are considered, according to the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and as reflected in the training guide, what are considered to be priority 3 impacts, which are impacts on human rights, which doesn't mean they're not important, but they're less prioritized than the other risks that companies face and the other impacts that they have in these areas. So priority 1 impacts are impacts on both conflict and human rights, and priority 2 impacts are impacts on conflict that have nothing or very little to do with human rights. It's then necessary to build upon this analysis, which is touched upon in the guide, but not in a very deep way, to build upon the heightened human rights due diligence assessment that is done, to then really understand what are also, in addition to these priority risks, potential IHL-related obligations and legal compliance-related issues. So over to you, Ben.
Thanks very much, Josie. And just very briefly, thanks, Anisha. Thanks to UNDP. Thanks to the panel and everyone attending for the opportunity to be with you today. I appreciate it very much. The manual, as Josie indicated, illustrates and expounds upon a number of points of differentiation between human rights due diligence and heightened human rights due diligence. Our engagement with companies, with other experts, with colleagues in the field and so on suggests there's still a long way to go to ensure that these distinctions are understood. So we thought there might be some value in pulling out from different parts of the manual some of those key distinctions and presenting them here all in one place. So the first of these is geography. As I'm sure everyone is aware, human rights due diligence is a matter of corporate responsibility everywhere. This is not the case for heightened human rights due diligence. Heightened human rights due diligence is a matter of corporate responsibility when businesses or their supply and value chains exist in areas that are affected by conflict or at a high risk of becoming affected by conflict. There's a number of good questions as to what that means exactly. What kinds of countries are we talking about, or contexts are we talking about? The manual addresses that in some detail, but suffice to say that this is a core distinction between human rights due diligence and heightened human rights due diligence. And the reason why, if we look at the rationales for human rights due diligence and heightened human rights due diligence and the distinction between those, as we know, ordinary business activities may be conducted in a manner that is abusive of human rights, and that can happen anywhere, really. But in conflict-affected and high-risk areas, those areas are marked by, obviously, the presence of violent conflict, but also in the case of high-risk areas, deeply fragmented societies, very high rates of poverty and unemployment, a state that may be sort of systematically abusive of certain populations or captured by narrow interests, judiciaries that may not be independent, and so on, all these questions related to weak governance. In such contexts, the risks that ordinary business activities unfold in ways that cause, sustain, or intensify violent conflict is greatly elevated, and therefore there's a corporate responsibility when business is being done in those areas to address those impacts, to identify and address those impacts. If we look at modalities of analysis, this is another key distinction. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with human rights impact assessments as an aspect of heightened human rights due diligence. That's the kind of hallmark analysis modality. Heightened human rights due diligence includes a human rights impact assessment, but it also includes an assessment of the company's impact on conflict dynamics, conflict drivers, conflict actors, and conflict parties. Again, this is covered in a lot more detail in the manual, but that essentially creates a two-part analysis that really, in very important ways, differentiates heightened human rights due diligence from human rights due diligence. One of the reasons why relates to the nature of the impacts that those forms of analysis are attempted to capture, the impacts and risks. Typically in human rights due diligence, the impacts and risks in question relate to individuals and their rights. In some cases, in the case of indigenous communities, for instance, we may have collective or group rights that are at play. But in heightened human rights due diligence, we're really talking about conflict dynamics. And this can be anything from the capacity of an illegal armed group to finance its own activities or engage in conflict, the relationships between social groups, religious or ethnic groups that may be in conflict or tensions, the incentives that a state has to use violence in the service of a political agenda, for instance. So all of those things may be included in the nature of the impacts and risks that we want to uncover in analysis and address in practice. When it comes to mitigation, I'm sure, again, everyone on the call is familiar with the tripartite mitigation prioritization rubric that is laid out in the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, where scope, scale, and irremediability of a risk or an impact would be the factors that determine its prioritization among all of the other risks and impacts that may exist. There is a different framework for that in heightened human rights due diligence. I mentioned the two kinds of analysis looking for human rights impacts and risks and conflict impacts and risks. That analysis will yield three buckets: human rights risks and impacts, conflict risks and impacts, and then risks and impacts that relate to both. And those correspond to priorities 1, 2, and 3 for the purposes of mitigation, where priority 1 is risks and impacts that relate to both human rights and conflict. Priority 2 are risks and impacts that relate to conflict but not to human rights. And priority 3 relates to human rights but not to conflict. And then within each of those three buckets, the scope, scale, and irremediability rubric from the Guiding Principles applies. And then finally, there are distinctions with respect to disclosure. The Guiding Principles, of course, observe that interested parties have a legitimate interest in company disclosures with respect to the human rights risks of their business activities and what they're doing to mitigate those. And companies, therefore, have an obligation to disclose, or I should say a responsibility to disclose to those interested parties, who include, of course, stakeholders, but also shareholders and potentially others. In heightened human rights due diligence, because we're talking about conflict-affected contexts or high-risk contexts, and we're talking about issues that are intrinsically tangled up in conflict or may affect conflict actors and so on, disclosures can also drive or generate new risks, and therefore there needs to be a process of vetting any disclosures for sensitivities and with an eye to anticipating the potential impacts of disclosure. So let me hand over to Sarah from there.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So finally, I thought we would go through the steps that are required to undertake a heightened human rights due diligence assessment. On the slide, there are 5, but in the guide, there are 8. It's mostly just for time and kind of to highlight the kind of critical steps along the path. That's right. It's really important to highlight that each step builds upon one another. So it's not that they come independently, but they are rather sequential. The primary steps involve analysis, planning that is then based on that analysis, implementation, management, and adaptation of those plans based on changing circumstances. So the first step, as you can see, is to undertake a conflict analysis, as both my colleagues have talked quite a bit about. But conflict analysis inherently is the study of causes, actors, and dynamics of the conflict. It's likely to highlight potential or likely conflict triggers, as well as potential scenarios relating to the way conflict might unfold, as well as the prospects for resolving or addressing that conflict. Inherently, a conflict analysis unpacks the environment by exposing structural dynamics relating to the country or the local context, political, socio-economic, environmental, security, and institutional systems, as well as behavioral, relating to the actions undertaken by actors in that context, and attitudinal, so also relating to perceptions of culture, psychology. And inherently, when you bring those together, you're able to understand the range of dynamics that exist within the localized context and how actors and dynamics interact with one another. For the purposes of heightened human rights due diligence assessments, it's really critical to then understand those dynamics, to then situate the company in relation to those dynamics, to discern the different courses of action that might affect the issues or the parties involved in the conflict, and as well as the company's impact on that conflict. Here, really inherently core features of a good conflict analysis would raise issues at play at the conflict, the actors and relationships among those actors, and existing mitigation options or ways of which to resolve conflict issues. So once the conflict analysis is undertaken and conflict is well understood, it becomes more easy to identify potential and actual impacts of the business on conflict and human rights. It does this by mapping the operation, so including the relevant relationships and connections to the conflict and engaged stakeholders. It's really important, though, in this context to remember that in context of conflict and heightened human high-risk environments, companies' actions are never neutral. So they're always going to have a positive or never negative impact on the conflict system. That inherently means that the companies can trigger, drive, exacerbate, or sustain conflict between themselves and communities, but they can also trigger, exacerbate, sustain conflicts among different groups of stakeholders. Inherently, this means that it's possible for the company to adversely impact conflict that the company itself does not cause or bring about through its own actions or inactions. And so here in these scenarios, companies' conflict and human rights risks and impacts arise from the efforts or actions or inactions of the companies, as well as its contractors, suppliers, distributors, and other actors. So it's not just the company itself, but it's its entire value chain. As Ben just mentioned, it's then the nature of the scale of the business activities and those value chains that provide significant determinants for the risks and impacts that the company may have on the conflict. And because of this, conflict and human rights risks and impacts can be expected to vary quite distinctly between companies depending on these factors. So once you're able to understand the analysis and kind of the range of conflict impacts and risks, as well as human rights impacts and risks, you can then prioritize as based on the UN Working Group's categorization of hierarchy of mitigation priorities, as Ben and Josie have both outlined. The first priority being conflict and human rights risks. These are risks that drive both human rights risks as well as conflict risks, activities or omissions that constitute both abuses to human rights as well as intensify conflict. Second priority risks are conflict risks, as we have mentioned. These are risks that drive or sustain conflict but do not address necessarily human rights risks. And then third priority are just human rights risks. So these are risks to human rights abuses but do not have conflict in indications. So once we can then determine the kind of types of risks and the priority of risks that the company may have on the context based on the conflict analysis, we're then able to develop mitigation strategies to address these. We're able to understand the relationship that the company has in relationship to these range of risks and impacts, and then determine how the company is connected to them. So as Ben just mentioned, there are kind of three buckets: cause, contribution, and linkage. So cause meaning that the company's actions, activities, products, or services themselves are generating the impact, where then the minimum responsibilities to prevent that. Contribution, where the company's activities, products, or services might be impact more severe, likely, or consequentially, but not sufficiently to themselves causing the impact. And here, the minimum responsibility of the company would to prevent the contribution, as well as the contribution to be ceased or remedied, and use leverage to encourage other contributors to prevent or cease and remedy these contributions. And then finally, linkage, which tends to be the most common in a lot of these contexts, in which the company's actions or products or services are linked to the context or conflict, but they are not necessarily the driver or contributing to it. And therefore, the minimum responsibility is to use this leverage to prevent or mitigate impact, as well as to use their leverage to induce other actors to remedy this impact. So once we understand not only the conflict analysis and then the impacts in range and then the connectivity that the company has to those, we then need to validate the mitigation options. And this is quite important, as Ben was kind of alluding to, because when we devise mitigation efforts, we want to ensure that they do not have additional impacts in that context, so second order risks inherently. Without input from stakeholders, mitigation plans can omit key details and considerations that can yield counterintuitive or perverse or unintended impacts. And therefore, companies need to check their mitigation plans with stakeholders, local stakeholders, and national stake or shareholders, as Ben was saying, for possibility of unintended impacts, foreseeable pitfalls in these plans. So that's where the 5 kind of on this line end, but the 6 would then be we would advise companies to then implement these plans, integrate them into the company's internal governance, accountability systems, policies, and standing operating procedures. Then the next step would be to disclose or communicate heightened human rights due diligence efforts to all key stakeholders, as Ben was mentioning, particularly in conflict and challenging environments. This is quite critical to ensure that everyone is coming from a same understanding of the context and what the response of the company is. And then finally, to repeat these steps, we all know inherently conflict dynamics are consistently evolving and conflict is never static. These fragile environments are constantly changing, and thus our analysis must be reviewed in an ongoing manner so we can adapt and modify our plans based on the changing nature of the context. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Josie, Ben, Sarah. That was tour de force run through of the key questions around the training facilitation guide and heightened human rights due diligence. And thanks very much also for sticking to time. We will now switch to the second portion of today's launch, which is our panel. So with that being said, let me introduce our panelists. So first, we have Kendall Salcito, who's a founder and CEO of Norma Gaia. Kendall has advised various industry groups on corporate human rights performance. She's contributed to the development of the UN Guiding Principles. And beyond that, she is also the director of human rights for Alcoa. and she holds a PhD from the Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute in Epidemiology and an MA for Journalism from the University of British Columbia. Our second panelist is Peter Webster, who has led the IRIS Foundation, which is a charity, a civil society group that does research, advice, and advocacy on sustainable finance since, and I don't know if I should say this out loud, Peter, but since 1983. And Peter has been the treasurer of the UK Sustainable Investment and Finance Association for 20 years. He was until 2011, and he was a member of the PRI Advisory Council. So welcome, Peter. And our third panelist is my colleague Omar Al-Asuli, who is from the UNDP Program of Assistance to the Palestinian People. Omar manages the UNDP Rule of Law Access to Justice program in Palestine through the Sawasiyah 3 project, and he's worked for the past 16 years in Palestine on enhancing access to justice through innovative solutions in institutional capacity building. And Omar, a couple of years ago, reached out to float the idea of launching a business and human rights project in Palestine, which I think everybody would agree is more pertinent than ever. So with that being said, welcome to all three of you. And
Thanks.
I thought I would ask all three a couple of questions. So I'd ask you to be relatively brief because we also want to make time for a Q&A. Kendall, first question to you is, from your work with companies, and we've heard your experience, how much of the difficulty in implementing heightened human rights due diligence comes actually from a lack of clarity or practical guidance, and to what extent can a guide like this, a training facilitation guide, help companies move from awareness to actually changing their practices? Over to you.
That is a really good, very much 2-point question. Just to start with, there's an enormous need for practical guidance. I'm not in the private sector anymore, but a colleague in the business sector reached out just last month asking how to identify conflict-affected high-risk areas. And I was able to point straight to the guide and say, there are tools listed in here that can help you identify CARAs. And while you're there, you can dig into some of the trickier how-tos of human rights due diligence. I think that in our space, we come to feel that our knowledge is shared pretty broadly, but companies, not all, but some are struggling with every step from like knowing when it's required to knowing how to do it, to knowing how to act on it. And I see this guide as serving a dual function of roadmap for effective heightened human rights due diligence, and maybe also sort of alarm bell that very few companies have the personnel and competencies and resourcing to internally do this right. And I think that gets to the second half of your question, where I already see legal teams trying to take this on because they see liability risk. And well, yes, there is liability risk for a company that walks blithely into a militarized context and starts making deals, but the lawyers are not going to be the sole and most effective investigators or implementers. And I think this guide really helps shine light on the multiple risks beyond legal that conflict-affected and high-risk areas pose, and highlight the competencies needed from meaningfully engaging through conflict analysis, because a heavily privileged document owned by legal is going to stymie the relationship building that's needed to manage human rights in these conflict-affected areas. And I think this guide is sort of brilliantly sneaky in that it educates the reader while purporting to merely facilitate trainings. Someone might pick it up and think they're going to run an internal training with legal on heightened human rights due diligence, but be expanding their invite list and revisiting their budgeting by the time they set it down.
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much. It's good to hear that it will be useful. And as you said, that it'll take matters out of the hands of purely legal and, make it sort of a concern for others in the business itself. So I'd like to turn now to Omar and just explore a bit the context of Palestine. So in the context of Palestine, why is heightened human rights due diligence particularly important at this moment? And if you can tell us just a bit about how can meaningful implementation of heightened human rights due diligence change, and what can it change for rights holders in Palestine compared to the current state of play? So what would essentially change if heightened human rights due diligence was implemented properly by businesses operational in or investing in Palestine. Over to you, Omar.
Thank you, Sinisha, and thanks for the colleagues for the great presentation and overview of the guidelines. Look, I mean, the scale of the destruction of private properties and civilian infrastructure in this war is something that we haven't seen since 1948 in Palestine, and that brings about two challenges for businesses and also for duty barriers. I mean, the first one is related to the, companies and governments that are involved in the supply of equipments or technologies that have or still are contributing to the war effort. And the second one is also challenges related to the massive scale of reconstruction needed to restore basic services and functional neighborhoods. And if anyone have had the chance to look at, the floating plans, including the Great Plan, which basically, private companies are being quoted as potential companies to do reconstruction in Gaza, and it's basically altering the whole dynamics in the enclave. So yeah, the reconstruction is definitely another challenge. And now on what might meaningful implementation of the human rights due diligence change for right holders in Palestine. See, the threshold for human rights standards in this kind of context changes. So the general population is less concerned with demanding their rights or holding duty barrier responsible. They're rather busy in trying to survive each day and secure their family's livelihood. And in this context, it's upon the human rights driven organizations to ensure that local stakeholders, party to the conflict, investors, regulators, are all aware of the human rights due diligence. Also, the people who are most impacted by the war need to know that they are entitled to demand the companies, particularly multinational corporations, to respect their rights and to comply with hHRDD. And that duty barriers provide them with access to remedy when these companies fail to comply. And I think implementing a BHR project in Palestine and using this training guidelines, because we've just started implementing this project basically last year on the ground, is really important because we can clarify not only just companies, local and international, but also to right holders. What are the concepts? Who is the duty barrier? What are the responsibilities? What's the reputational risks? What are the legal risks, etc. So, I mean, helping with contextualizing what can be a human right violation under this particular context is very important.
Thanks very much, Omar. I think you've even gone some way towards answering some of the questions in the Q&A, but we'll get on to those a bit later. Okay, turning it over now to Peter. So Peter, obviously you work very closely with investors, and as conflict risks increase globally exponentially, how are investors thinking about companies operating in these environments? And to what extent is the quality of companies' human rights due diligence and heightened human rights due diligence beginning to influence investment decisions, risk assessments, or even perceptions of long-term value?
Thank you, Sinisa. Those are good questions. And thank you very much for the opportunity to answer, and to fellow panelists for what's already been a fascinating conversation. I mean, let me tell it from the point of view of the Conflict Risk Network's work. This is a network of investors with a history in looking at Sudan, which is a kind of knowledge and peer-to-peer hub. So, as you were saying, Sinisa, as conflict has become more widespread, the number of investors who are concerned that their portfolios may be more exposed to conflict has been growing. And in fact, the first thing they discovered was that they couldn't find out how exposed their portfolios were to conflict. So this is a mixture of things. Some of the traditional data providers have withdrawn services which directed people to conflict-affected areas, partly because of concerns about whether their coverage of Israel-Palestine might be anti-Semitic in some way. And that has meant that people had less data to know where their exposures were. There are now more data providers coming forward with all sorts of interesting solutions that will help people assess that. So one of the problems is, how exposed is my whole portfolio? How big an issue is this for me? The second one is that they've picked up particular conflicts over time. So both Myanmar and Sudan were cases where investors came together to write letters calling on companies to do various things, but they were heavily based on human rights due diligence. So clear signs there that what the investors were looking for was human rights due diligence, or heightened human rights due diligence. And in the case of Russia, there's been the challenge of responsible exit. Many people are being asked to leave, and trying to think through what a responsible exit would look like. And obviously, I mean, as we've heard already, there's loads of questions being asked of investors about Gaza and the West Bank. I think one of the big things just to mention is not specifically what we're talking about today in detail, but investors have become very concerned about investing in the defence sector, because the parts of their portfolio which is exposed to defence, particularly as the tech companies get so heavily involved, massively increasing with increased defence spending and new types of involvement in defence. So we're involved with a project called Guidance for Responsible Investment in Defence, which is another network of investors trying to work out what people should do there. And I do think this guide is really, really useful because, I mean, obviously investors in a particular case are worried about risks to assets. So the whole process of understanding what's going on in a conflict, thinking about how to remain responsibly, thinking about how to exit if you had to, all of that is very important for looking at the assets that the investors own. But they're also worried about risks to staff and other rights holders. I mean, for example, human rights defenders are usually in a much worse position in a conflict-affected setting. And companies need to be able to talk to their own staff urgently about their needs and challenges and how they're seeing the conflict and so on. So the guide is brilliant on that kind of stuff as well. And in terms of longer-term value, I mean, the biggest long-term issue is the extent to which conflict destroys value generally for investors. And so the whole idea of identifying any ways that you might actually be driving the conflict, with one company and what it's doing, which could be affecting the whole of your portfolio in other ways. So I think it's really useful, and we'll talk some more in the next round of questions, but I think it helps companies get to exactly the sort of details that investors will be very interested to hear about.
Thanks very much, Peter. So speaking of questions, we obviously scheduled a Q&A session. Sometimes that means that we anticipate not having questions, that we have fake questions. Unfortunately, this time we have lots of questions as it happens. So could I ask our authors and panelists to feel free to type answers? You don't have to. I mean, we'll get to these questions to the degree that we can. But if there are any questions that you think you want to answer in the Q&A, and that obviously also goes to Ben, Sarah, and Josie, please feel free to type answers, and I'll try to get to all of these questions in the Q&A session afterwards. But let me just come back to our panel, first of all, for a couple more questions to hear from them. So in terms of the kind of outlook and how we're going to get stronger practice, Kendall, over to you. So given the increasing complexity of conflict-affected context that we're seeing globally, what is the outlook for heightened human rights due diligence, and what kinds of incentives do you think are needed for companies to take this more seriously, integrate it into their core decision making?
Another really good multi-part question. The complexity of conflict-affected environments is increasing partly because they're compounded by external forces like climate change, and partly because values-based norms like democracy and human rights have been eroding worldwide. And so the outlook for heightened human rights due diligence from a practical standpoint is that it is increasingly necessary. The sparks and tinder for conflict are now harder to see and faster to ignite. And I feel like there's a question in the chat that sort of hints at the rapid change of conditions, and whether that makes it impractical to do heightened human rights due diligence. On the contrary, it just makes it a much more useful tool. And I think that companies that are seeking business opportunities and celebrating the role of a heavy-handed state can be lulled into a false sense of security by these anti-democratic leaders that are cloaking conflict in terms of internal political issues as sort of code for quashing dissent. And we have seen that backfire, actually, on companies, for example, sourcing from the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, briefly when universities and nonprofit groups were supporting regulators to enforce forced labor and import bans. budget and funding cuts to human rights-oriented offices in multilateral institutions and in governments, combined with the extreme pressure that we're seeing on human rights defenders, as my colleagues have mentioned, are stymieing and stalling this external research and these partnerships. So one thing that we need is for state agencies tasked to enforce the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD, and other emerging and evolving regulations to get a really strong grasp of heightened human rights due diligence so that the regulations that they write will reward companies for identifying complexity and fragility and conflict risks while penalizing these kind of bland and heavily redacted claims of others when they turn out to have glossed over risk factors. I think we might even need regulations that allocate state resources, like support from foreign offices, to companies that disclose detailed concerns about operating in fragile contexts. I know this is a sensitive moment in Europe, and as someone based in the United States, I don't have any right to be talking about this, but as European citizens and governments are approaching rearmament, they have some level of trepidation, and that sentiment can in some ways inform how they want multinational companies to be influencing conflict risks abroad. We can't afford to have companies destabilizing other regions for profit right now, and regulators should be anticipating that risk and developing indicators of conflict exacerbation that they can enforce against this if necessary. And I think this comes to another question that was in the chat around how companies can exacerbate conflict. If I pay taxes to a government that uses those resources to buy more weaponry, then I've exacerbated conflict. I think there are probably other great examples my colleagues can point to also. So I will end there.
Thanks very much, Kendall. I'll turn back to Omar. And Omar and Peter, I'd ask you to keep it relatively brief. Sorry, I can see that we have 23 questions here, and I'd like to try and get to as many of them as we can. So, Omar, looking again at Palestine, and we focused a lot on businesses. Obviously, the guide itself is on business for businesses, and the training facilitation guide applies to businesses, but others are needed as well. So, what kinds of support or partnerships are most needed to enable companies to conduct meaningful heightened human rights due diligence? And how can someone like UNDP, how can an organization like UNDP create those conditions that make better practice more feasible in this context?
Well, thank you, Sinisha. Look, in Palestine, the major problem is that the legal and regulatory environment is very fragmented, and there are no reliable data that can be, it's very hard for companies to access. Also, the political context is very sensitive, and it's very hard to carry out human rights due diligence actually under these circumstances. One of the colleagues have commented in the comment is that also, in conflict, context is changing all the time. So how can you do these analysis, while this context is changing on a daily basis, which is very true. What companies need the most is maybe a practical guideline on how to reflect these realities on their day-to-day operations and work. Also, in a strategic way, how can they position themselves and risk and do a mapping for the risks, maybe by sector. What UNDP can help by offering in neutral space for dialogue, practical guidance in line with international standards, training for both companies, public institutions. Also, UNDP can support development of context-specific risk tools and grievances mechanisms, or at least, help people have access to grievance mechanism, and create platforms where businesses can learn from each other. There was a mention of other conflicts also by Peter, and the fact that there are some similarities that can be drawn from that. We can also create support coordination and dialogue between businesses, civil society organization, public authorities, and we can help make responsible business practices more realistic and achievable in this environment. And I think, there was also something in the chat on a constitutional court ruling that was issued, which I think, if we can help have better access to these type of examples from around the world, people can also take that into consideration and then have access to these type of decisions, use them as remedies, and or potentially for developing remedies locally in Palestine.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much.
Also good to mention that
Yes, go ahead.
module 5 and module 6 of the training guide is actually very helpful for this type of work. So I mean, also it can help us take these two modules and try to implement them here locally in Palestine. So I think this is a good reference to make.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, and then Peter, the last question in this round of questions. So what would help investors better assess whether companies are meaningfully addressing heightened human rights risks in conflict-affected areas? Are there particular types of disclosures, examples, evidence that would make it easier to distinguish more responsible and resilient companies?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I do note the point before that was made about disclosures themselves might cause trouble. So people need to think carefully what they're disclosing. But models of good practice are actually really helpful, and the guide has got some interesting ones in it, partly because for an investor to understand that kind of case in detail means that when they talk to another company, they're able to draw on that and learn parallels and maybe suggest some things that company could do more effectively because they know it's been done somewhere else. So other mechanisms for getting models of good practice out there would be great. Generally, I think it's kind of tricky questions that imply substance, that imply that something's really happening in the company. I mean, I remember a conversation with a company I should probably not name that was under a lot of pressure to leave a particular conflict, and the human rights expert thought they hadn't done all the due diligence, but the CEO on the ground, from what she was saying, had clearly done a lot of things that were in human rights due diligence. So I think just clarifying what people want to hear about is really helpful, and then saying as much as you can on those things. So, as an investor, does this company sound like it does understand the conflict? Is it being careful about where the links are to their value chain, whether that's supply chain in some conflicts, whether it's customers in others, what products or services they're supplying in? Do they seem to have thought about it? I would actually put a particular focus on governance. I mean, you say in the guide stuff about making sure all the right people are involved, but I think also being very clear about where decisions are going to be made about staying responsibly, leaving responsibly, whatever. That kind of clarity that there are mechanisms in place considering scenarios within the company is the sort of governance question that an investor would like. And on stakeholders, I mean, does it sound plausible? Can the company tell you what they're hearing from their stakeholders if they can do that in a non-dangerous way? But does it sound like, from what you know, what would be heard from people in that conflict? Can they articulate what their plan for staying responsibly looks like? And I would say, do they have an exit plan? I mean, even if you hope never to use it, an exit plan should definitely be there. So if being able to talk about that, I know that can be commercially tricky, but like all of those things really will give the investor a clear idea that something's actually happening. And I do think this guide, just reading it through, is brilliant in terms of prepping company people to talk to investors. If they understand all those things and have applied them to their company, they're going to be in a good place to have those conversations.
Great. Thanks very much, Peter. Okay, so now we turn to, I'm rushing through this because I realize we have a lot of questions. It's good to see all of the interest in this training facilitation guide and obviously in the subject. And I'll try and direct these to some of our panelists and authors, and try and take them as they came. The first unanswered question was in Colombia, but I'll try and set that aside because it seems to imply a relatively good knowledge of Colombian law. Unless somebody has and please do put your hand up, any of the panelists or authors, if you have any thoughts on how to develop more broadly beyond the Colombian Constitutional Court ruling, how to develop a standard on heightened human rights due diligence. I will say from our perspective, I know of at least one country where we're working that is developing human rights due diligence legislation that is going to be including a standard on heightened human rights due diligence. And I would advise you, I think Lena is the person asking the question, to look at the way that heightened human rights due diligence was incorporated in the CS3D in Recital 42 and then combined with the main body of the law. So the next question was how to manage the engagement process with civil society organizations that are linked to or influenced by illegal armed groups in conflict areas. I don't know if any of the authors would like to answer that. Perhaps I'll throw it over to Josie or Ben or Sarah, if anybody wants to come in.
I'm happy to take an initial stab, but I'm sorry to say that it's very difficult to answer the question given the way that it's framed. I mean, I think to me, one of the points of heightened human rights due diligence is to develop a relatively granular understanding of who the actors are in a scenario, how they're linked, what interests they share in common, where their interests may diverge, and so forth. I mean, that is part of the point of the analysis in the first place. So in the end, and the mitigation options that flow from that analysis should be based on that analysis. So without that kind of detail in the basic premise, it's very, very difficult to answer that question in a way that's meaningful. I mean, it really depends entirely on the civil society organization, the armed groups in question, the context, who else is there doing what, wanting what, saying and thinking what, how they all relate to the company and its business activities, and maybe local communities that are the company's stakeholders. It's just not possible to answer in that generic formulation, I'm sorry to say.
I suspect, Ben, if you could stay on, I suspect you might say the same thing about the next question, which is, should a company continue operating in a high-risk country if leaving may harm workers, but staying may contribute? And now this question has gone. I mean, you go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say that this relates to the whole question of responsible exit, which is beginning to develop its own sort of literature and case studies and so on in response to that. So essentially, analysis should feed into companies' decisions about whether or not to stay or to leave, and the guiding principles spell out the conditions that should be considered for weighing those two alternatives. Of course, in cases where staying involves both harms and benefits, and leaving involves both harms and benefits, which is to say, in most cases, those need to be weighed and balanced against each other, and the possibility of mitigating the harms associated with staying and the harms associated with leaving also needs to be considered. But there's no one right answer, one size fits all. Even in the same context, two companies that might be in the same industry might answer that question differently because they have slightly different relationships, slightly different stakeholder groups, slightly different resources and capacities amongst their personnel, and so on. I mean, there might be any number of ways in which those two answers, I mean, there's no mathematical formula that spits out the right answer, and two companies in very, very similar circumstances might answer it differently.
Thank you, Ben. The next question is on shipping companies, but I would ask if anybody feels like they are expert enough in shipping companies to type an answer to that question. The next one I might throw over to Sarah. If you're, because of your name checked here, which is, I understand the theory and I don't understand the application. Can we talk about a theory in the context of a heightened human rights due diligence that's been checked with stakeholders and made available to the affected people? I don't know if you have any thoughts on this question.
Sure. I mean, I think that while a lot of it feels theoretical in terms of how we might go about a conflict analysis or understanding kind of mitigation options and then assessing those against that verification mechanisms, it's really relational. It's all about relationships with local stakeholders. It's all about building your social license and how and the ways in which you engage local communities to then understand and verify what you're hearing. Very often it's common that local stakeholders will be able to see and understand and put forward various conflict conditions and the ways in which conflict might exacerbate or be created. And therefore, when you start to have plans for mitigation options, it's important to bring those to communities. So it's all about your local relationships and the ways in which you engage and build trust with local communities. I think I answered the question. I'm not sure.
Thank you. The next couple, I think we can type answers to. I'd be happy to answer the next one. And then there's one regarding OHCHR. And I see that Adrienne is here. And I might turn to you just if we have time. I'm just mindful of the fact that we're running out of time. There's a question, and perhaps I can turn to our panel for this as well, if anybody wants to answer. Could you reflect on the opportunities and challenges faced by companies that often find themselves in situations where they become co-guarantors of human rights in the face of a quasi-absence of a state in some areas, especially at the local level and in indigenous context? I don't know, Kendall, if you have any thoughts on this.
Yeah. And this kind of builds on what Peter was saying earlier. a company's due diligence starts before they enter a conflict affected or fragile area. And there should be some red lines early on where you know that if this change happens, you're at an inflection point. And if this change happens, you're at a different inflection point. And if you miss those points, then you face a lot more challenges. But if you reach those points and you say, you know, we can either stay or leave, but if we stay, we need to do these other things. There are real opportunities for companies to contribute to peace building in some contexts. Co-guarantors of human rights. In indigenous contexts, this is probably, am I answering the right question, by the way?
Yes.
No. Okay, good. In indigenous contexts, I think the opportunities are really great because very few national laws protect the sovereignty of indigenous populations and the way indigenous populations view their own entitlements. And so a company that recognizes that an oppressive state is not going to acknowledge the territorial rights of a traditional group can build that into their relationship with the government and with companies and with communities. And we've seen this in Canada, actually, where indigenous populations have said, this is our traditional land. You're allowed to be here. The government says so, and we do. We need you to change the way your effluent is treated so it doesn't affect our fish. The company can respond to the indigenous population, make a modification, bring that back to the state, and the state will say, sure, you can spend more money doing your environmental management. And then there's a better relationship across all parties. So there are great opportunities in some contexts.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm afraid, unfortunately, we've run out of time. We're a minute. We have a minute left to go, so I'll just use that opportunity to wrap up. I see that Omar has his hand up, and I apologize to all those whose questions we haven't got to. That's simply due to a lack of time. Omar, if you have a last
Just
word
quickly on
before I
the
wrap
shipping
up. Thank you.
company's response. Just quickly on the shipping company's responsibility. Maybe like you said, we're not experts on that. I know that they have they have to comply with lots of laws and regulation. But what I would like to recognize is that during the war, I mean, lots of European and Mediterranean dock workers unions have agreed that they will not be handling any shipments that are contributing to the conflict in Gaza. And I think, I mean, this is another example. It doesn't have to always be the companies or just the local CSOs or international NGOs. Sometimes also unions are also a very major player, and they've managed to disrupt lots of shipments that could have contributed to affecting or impacting human rights for the Palestinian people. So I think, I mean, that's another frontier where we need to also keep our eyes and work with unions on these issues. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Omar, for that. Okay, with that being said, now we're a minute over time. Thanks to Josie, thanks to Ben, thanks to Sarah for their wonderful work on, it was a pleasure creating the training facilitation guide with them, and for the presentations. Thanks to Kendall, Peter, and Omar for their great contributions today. Thanks to all of you. I think there were nearly 250 people here. So that kind of is evidence of the interest in this topic and the need for this sort of guidance. We at UNDP will continue working on this issue in Palestine and beyond, so please feel free to reach out. And thanks very much, and we look forward to seeing you down the road. Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
very much. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you all
Thanks,
so
everyone.
much.
Thanks, everyone.